Thank you for tuning in to Mindful Conversations. See you soon as our series continues.
Welcome to iEvolve Global's official website, your online portal for initiating becoming a better you. Our website features several services geared towards evolving into that person you dream of through coaching, mentorship, counseling, speaking engagements, and much more. Our website boasts a change corner with quotes, verses, tips, and tricks to get you through that rough patch. In addition to our self-help corner, which gives you all the tools, resources, and statistics about mental health and the process of change. Our website aims to get you engaged. It's filled with the resources you need to become a better you. And if ever you need to talk, contact us. Our team of experts are waiting to assist you. Welcome to iEvolve, the roadmap to a better me.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are, welcome. I'm Sharika Anderson, the CEO of iEvolve Global. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us tonight. Thank you for joining us for another mindful conversation. Our topic tonight is childhood trauma. My life tells the tale. Now, of course, next month we will be celebrating Child's Month, and as such, our conversation this time around is going to be focusing on the children. I don't know if you agree with me, but in the last couple of months, we have been hearing of all kind of news and incidents surrounding our children. Just last week, there was an incident where two teenagers were in an altercation. One ended up stabbed one, and he met his demise. And that's just one of many. Many of us too, especially if we're in Jamaica, we would have heard about the multiple school incident that happened last week involving our children. Now, it's not only violence. There are several activities that we have been hearing concerning our children. And guess what? I know you are wondering what is happening. Well, tonight we are here to help you out. We are here to help you out. There are several factors that could be contributing to it, but tonight we are delving into one of those factors: childhood trauma. Now, let me not talk much more because we have experts who are well equipped and very knowledgeable, and they are here to share with all of us. But just before we do that, just before they come in, I'm asking you just to go ahead and like, share, invite somebody, because tonight we are going to be talking about things that you can benefit from. So go ahead, share, invite your friend. Let somebody know that they can't afford to miss it tonight. All right? So let's just jump right in and bring them right on. I know they are just itching to start sharing with you. All right? Let us welcome
Mrs. Tanika Casanova Durant has a BSc in Social Work from the UWI. MSW Social Work Clinical Specialization from the UWI. She has over 19 years of clinical practice and currently serves as placement coordinator with Child Protection and Family Services Agency. She is a minister of religion in the Church of God of Prophecy and is married to her boyfriend for over 10 years. Sophie Mayer is an associate counseling psychologist, currently working in the child and adolescent mental health clinics in the parish of St. Thomas. She has been working in this position for the past 6 years, and also worked as a counselor for 3 years with the Church Site Counseling Initiative. She has been a pastor for the past 16 years where she engages in pastoral counseling. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in theology, a Master of Arts degree in counseling psychology, and a postgraduate diploma in grief loss and trauma management.
Hi.
Hi, welcome, Tanika. Welcome, Pastor Sophie
Thank
Mayer. We are
you.
so happy to have both of you. And can
Thank
I tell you,
you.
we are excited? We are so excited. All right, who is next?
Mrs. Schwaneke Smith, née Hansen, is a wife, mother, psalmist, attorney at law, psychotherapist, motivational speaker, entrepreneur, mentor, and certified educator. She is currently in her 17th year of practice as an attorney at law, specializing in real estate, commercial and family law at her St. Andrew-based law firm. She holds a postgraduate diploma in education and is a seasoned lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Jamaica, where she instructs future attorneys in the modules of contract law and family law. This former Campion College head girl has represented academic excellence throughout her post-secondary educational journey, having graduated from the University of West Indies with first-class honors, the Norman Law School on the Principal's Honor Roll and as valedictorian, the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology's Master of Arts program in Counseling Psychology with high honors and as valedictorian.
Hi, Shawana K. Welcome,
Hey, ladies.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome. All right. Again, we are truly happy to have you. If you are here with us and you're hearing us and you just can't wait to get right into it, can you just help me to welcome our experts? Listen, it has been 3 days in one, 3 days in one, okay? But we are here tonight because we believe that this information is necessary and we can help persons to understand some of what is going on with our children. All right, so we're not going to delay this thing. We are delving in because we have a lot to unpack tonight. So we want to start with the very basic. There are different persons who have different understanding of what trauma is. So we want to start right there. We want to find out from our experts what can be considered as a trauma. We're going to start with our social worker, Mrs. Durant. Take it away.
Thank you. I want to, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining, and I hope that you will indeed like
Good
and share
evening.
so that other persons can benefit from the information that we will share this evening in this evening's program. So I am going to allow my fellow panelists to talk about the clinical definition of trauma, but in my studies, came upon a definition that I want to use from Levine and Klein, 2007. It says trauma happens when any experience stuns us like a bolt out of the blue. It overwhelms us, leaving us altered and disconnected from our bodies. And any coping mechanisms we have or may have had are undermined, and we feel utterly helpless and hopeless. It is as if our legs are knocked out from under us.
All right, so I'm just going to
Wrong.
comment. I'm just going to comment on the last part, right? Because that is just so much. That already is just so much where it says it feels as though our legs are knocked out from under us. And I think that point right there is just something for us to hold on to because if we're honest, the truth is sometimes that's how trauma causes us to feel. All right, so let's go now to Mrs. Smith and then we'll head on over to Miss Mayer.
All right. Thanks so much, Sharika. So, in a previous dispensation, just to provide some context,
Mm-hmm.
the concept of trauma was somewhat limited to someone's direct or indirect experience with respect to an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury. So initially it was confined to the threats of physical harm, whether personally or you're witnessing someone else being harmed. However, in the new dispensation, as we have evolved, we have realized that trauma also includes psychological abuse and that type of challenge that someone has. Basically, they're so overwhelmed that their capacity to digest whatever is happening is impaired. We also make reference to adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, whereby children experience situations whereby they feel unable to cope. Yes, and I guess as we go on, we will unpack and treat with the phenomenon. But essentially, one of the other things I wanted to point out as well is that trauma is not confined to a single, necessarily to a singular event. It can be one event, but it can also be over a period of time that this negative or adverse stimulus is being experienced by an individual.
Okay, so again, just to make sure that I'm following, right? Let me make sure I'm following. So one of the things that you said that is very critical is that it can be a single event, but it can also be over a period of time. So as such, for our viewers, what we have to understand is that it may just be that I was exposed once, it would have a similar impact, even if it was just one time. One time is enough for me to be traumatized. Thank you so much. All right, over now to Miss Mayor.
Okay, thank you again, Miss Anderson. And good night again to all of our viewers. All right, my two panelists have already said most of what I would have wanted to say. But just to basically reinforce what has already been said. So, first of all, when we think about trauma, historically, it was actually something that word started out in the medical field,
Mhm.
right? In terms of physical trauma. So persons coming in with a wound, right, would be treated for trauma, right? So the word trauma from the medical perspective actually speaks to a wound, right? And when we think about trauma, trauma is actually the response, right? Trauma is the response. And what are we responding to? We're basically responding to a terrifying event, a very stressful event. And the result of that is that we usually feel overwhelmed. We feel very hopeless. We feel a loss of control. And we feel literally like something bigger than us has come to destroy us, right? So it's a very overwhelming feeling. Persons usually feel overwhelmed to the point where our capacity to respond, our capacity to cope is not able to get us through, right? So basically, when we think, we just think of something larger than life because human beings are very resilient. We face stressful situations on a daily basis, and our coping mechanisms are able to get us through those stressful events. But a trauma is that response that event is just so much more than what we are able to cope with.
Okay. All right. So that's a mouthful right there. That is a mouthful. But what jumped out to me is that trauma is a response. And we are responding to something that was life threatening or something that or is beyond our normal capacity to cope. Wow. So you see, already we're getting into it because I'm sure if we ask some persons, hey, what is trauma? We'll get something else. But that's three different perspectives that really helps us to understand what trauma is. Now, Shawanake alluded to ACE earlier. I'm hoping that she'll tell us a bit more. But in addition to that, there was a study that was done in 2009 that found that 58% of 1,300 school children interviewed had experienced moderate to high levels of three types of violence. And what they also found is that persons would have experienced multiple traumatic experiences as children. So, what I want us to look at now is how common is childhood trauma. For some persons, we experience trauma later on,
think Sharika has a little delay.
Mhm.
So she was alluding to the fact that persons may experience trauma later on in life.
Right.
Mhm.
So I guess I went out for a minute. I don't know what's happening tonight, but it seemed like tonight we're experiencing all kind of technological challenges, but we're
Mm.
pressing on. So I
Right.
was saying that some of us experience trauma later on in life when we have had our first heartbreak, or we experience grief. But for some persons, they experience it in childhood. So what I want us to share based on our experience in the field, how common is childhood trauma based on your experiences? Is something that's very common, and maybe you can share some experiences. Let's start with Miss Mayor this time.
Okay, thanks again. All right, so believe it or not, childhood trauma in Jamaica and other parts of the world is very common, right? And why I say that, there are a lot of things that happen to our children that we think are just cultural things.
Mm-hmm.
We think that it's good parenting, when in truth and in fact, it is actually traumatic, right? One of the things that I have noticed in my practice, for example, is that there is a high prevalence of psychological trauma. And I'm speaking specifically of emotional and verbal abuse, right? In terms of how our children are dealt with in the home, in terms of how they're spoken to, in terms of how they're cared for and how they're parented. Many times there is emotional abuse, there is verbal abuse, right? There are others, but just to say that that alone is a case for the high prevalence of childhood trauma that I particularly am seeing in my practice.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And if I heard you correctly, one of the things that it sounded like is that we can be traumatizing the children and don't know. Or we can be doing it unintentionally
Hmm.
because we think that we are disciplining, right? Or we are, ensuring that they stay in line, and that's causing some amount of trauma. So that's very insightful, because that means that we have to look at how we're parenting our children, because we can be unintentionally traumatizing them. Thank you so much. All right, let's go over to Minister Tanika, Mrs. Durant.
Okay, and just to piggyback on that point, though, Miss Anderson, it just brings to bear how important it is for us to listen to our children. There's this adage that says children should be seen and not heard. I
Uh-huh.
am hopeful that we have gone away from that, and we are now more intentional about listening to the cares and to the concerns of children. Because as adults, we may perceive something to be traumatic to us, right? And we may think, well, children, they don't pay bills. I mean, they live in my house, they don't pay bills, they don't have any concerns. What should there be for them to be traumatized about? They have no responsibilities,
Mhm.
right? But there are things that go on in the school systems that negatively affect them and can be traumatic for them. For example, bullying. um Zooming in terms of my area of specialization, unfortunately we have to treat with a number of children who are victims of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. um and they would have experienced some acute, some complex traumas, some chronic traumatic events. A number of our children would have experienced multiple traumatic events. So they're from dysfunctional families. That's traumatic in itself, right? In the dysfunctional family, there may be a parent, somebody there, a significant other who is physically or sexually abusing him or her, that sort of thing. Going to school, because there's low self-esteem, that child may be a victim of bullying. And so there's a multiplicity of factors that we must consider, we must acknowledge. But we first have to recognize the importance of listening to our children and realizing the things that negatively affect them, what is most traumatic to them, and when it is that we need to intervene in terms of provide some level of support to the children when we identify that they are being traumatized for whatever reason.
Okay.
So if
All
I could
right.
also,
Go ahead.
yeah, so one of the things I wanted to point out is that, listen, it's trauma or trauma response. It's not a one size fits all. And I think sometimes as adults, we may say, well, I went through worse than that when I was growing up. You know, my grandfather or my father used to tie me to the post and beat me
Mhm.
and let ants bite me up if I wet the bed. So you have life easy now, you know. But the different stimulus or stimuli can have different impacts on different persons. So it's not a one size fits all. And also because we may have normalized some of these traumatic events and stressors, or we didn't have the language to even realize that my current response is a trauma response based on what I had experienced. It allows us now, to my mind, to be more mindful and intentional, because we can be unintentionally, as you're saying, passing on what I would perhaps call generational trauma. And secondly, in terms of the type you had asked about, some of the things that we experience. So one study coming out of the United States in 2020 suggested that one in three children, sorry, two in three children indicated that they had experienced at least one traumatic event by age 16. So in terms of the prevalence, we're seeing this is quite prevalent among children. And in terms of what are some of the things or examples of traumatic experiences, I believe Tanika mentioned bullying, also witnessing toxic relationships. Some of us perhaps don't realize that that's also potentially traumatizing to a child. So in my practice as a family law practitioner, I would have observed several family law matters before the court, and the thinking is, oh, our toxic behavior as parents between ourselves is not affecting the child because I'm a good mother, I'm a good father. But sometimes they don't realize that the bickering and using the child as a pawn and these unhealthy practices, that they're actually adversely affecting the child. And also in a society like Jamaica, unfortunately, the crime and violence is also traumatizing our children directly and indirectly. You see, where they are also victims of so many different crimes, sexual related crimes, physical abuse, and so on, neglect, unfortunately, as well as they themselves know sometimes form part of the system, unfortunately. So it manifests in different ways. And I believe as adults, it is our responsibility to not perpetuate some of the ills of the past, and not to use our past ability to overcome as an excuse not to change things now for the benefit of our children.
All right. Hold on. Hold on. Let me process all of this. Because I'm almost sure to the average person, when we hear trauma, we're thinking abuse, sexual abuse. But what we are hearing tonight is that it's so much wider than that. Right? We are hearing about parenting, the dysfunctional family setting, right? That can be traumatic, but not only home, also at school in terms of bullying, also
Mhm.
violence in the community. Why our children are exposed to trauma on every side, right? It's almost as if there's no escaping it. Another thing that stood out for me is two of three children experience at least one traumatic event by age 16. By age 16, two of three. So imagine you're in a classroom with 30 students. Let's break it down practically, 30 students, right? That statistics is saying 20 of those students would have experienced at least one. And you
Yep.
can just imagine what it looks like for multiple exposure. So that's very enlightening, and something for us to bear in mind. So when we see a child acting out, maybe we should ask, I wonder what traumatic event that child was exposed to. Very interesting. Now, but help us to understand what are some of the common signs, because I want to know, what do I need to look out for? How do I know that the child and not just some good lick the picnic wants, right? What are some of the signs for us to look out for?
Sharika seems to have frozen again. Perhaps if I could piggyback on the fact that she was frozen. I remember a 6-year-old who had, when I was doing my practicum for my master's in counseling psychology, and the parents reported that the child was in a catatonic state, as in, she's awake, but she doesn't seem to respond to any stimulus around her or people in her environment. And they were very concerned. And so they'll be calling her, let's say her name is Mary, 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 and there will be no response. She was just pretty much frozen. Yes. And then that was followed by panic attacks and extreme anxiety and fears of cobweb, fears of touching the floor, fears of eating certain food, fear of sunlight. It was a very interesting case. Yes. And when I met with the child alone, I was able to unearth that the source or the stimulus that allowed her to have that emotional or distressing response was the fact that she watched a movie, or I don't want to call the name of that series. Suffice to say, it treated with the realm of the supernatural. Yes.
Mm.
And apparently when they were casting spells and stealing souls, they it looked like a cobweb. Yes. And apparently she was watching this this show on a regular basis, and it
Mm.
totally traumatized her. But
Mhm.
after hearing about that, it still didn't add up as to why was she afraid of sunlight and afraid of certain foods. She then advised that, I'm going to use a pseudonym here. Let's call the person Mother Brown. She said, my parents, in trying to get me to stop, hiding and, lying without response and so on, what I did know, what they did, they took me to Mother Brown. So I said, tell me more about Mother Brown. So apparently Mother Brown was the community Obeah woman, for want of more forensic language. And long story short, Mother Brown had given certain instructions. She was not to be in the sunlight for more than a certain period of time. She was not to eat certain foods. And so, because she wanted to be well, she was thinking about what Mother Brown said, and it pretty much re traumatized and perpetuated her trauma response. And she was filled with anxiety. So, that is one example that was really remarkable for me in terms of just the things that we allow our children to be exposed to in the media can have this devastating effect on the child. And I allow my other panelists to give other examples from their practice.
Okay, so it seemed like tonight I'm playing Chinese skip in and out. But we're pressing on. I
Press
don't
up.
know what's happening, but we're pressing
Press up.
on. All right, so I was introducing the question in regards to common signs. So that's what
Right.
we were talking about. And I wanted us to answer from two different perspectives. I want us to talk about school level, right? So we can tie the knots together, the pieces together. So for our preschool children, Minister Tanika, what are some of the common signs? And then Miss Mary is going to talk to us about what are some of the common signs for children at the primary level. And then Mrs. Shawana K will speak to us at the secondary level. All right, so let's run it like that.
All right. So as it relates to our preschoolers are very vulnerable to traumatic events, and they will struggle to express their fears or their thoughts, and will show this through changes in behavior and how they function. So, for example, you would see behaviors such as them becoming clingy.
Mm,
Um, Let me give an example from my practice. So a case was brought to my attention some years ago, and the relative was saying, the child doesn't want to go to ex relative, and they could understand why, because this person, they support the family and is loving and caring and whatever. But every time that person would come around, or the child would be sent to this person, there would be an issue. Suffice to say that we found out after the fact that this person was actually molesting or abusing this preschooler. Child could not verbalize, but there was some indication in terms of how she responded to the presence of this person. So again, I must implore our parents to be very, very vigilant. It is unfortunate, but I must say it, that children are often abused by persons who have access to them, who they are close to, right? Who should be seen as persons who can be trusted with them. And so observation is very, very keen, especially as it relates to children, because they do not verbalize and articulate their feelings as much as or as well as the older children. We also see them regressing in terms of their development. So for example, if the child, was potty trained, you will see things like, them reverting to soiling themselves, that sort of thing, not being responsive, and so on, having attachment issues, having sleeping issues, having eating issues. The child is just not eating as well as before. It could be medical reasons, etc., etc., but it could be an indication that there's some amount of trauma going on. You may observe changes in how they interact in the play in play areas. Play therapy is one technique or strategy that is used often as it relates to treatment of children who are preschoolers who would have been victims of traumatic experiences, right? So in terms of how we observe how they interact in their times of play, sometimes you may observe them doing inappropriate things with their dolls and etc., etc., how they paint, or they crayon the colors that they choose, and how they, they crayon their things, and so forth and so on. So um we will see increased levels of fear as it relates to specific persons, or just general, levels of fear and anxiety, and so forth. So the issue with preschoolers, and why it is that they are so vulnerable, is their inability to articulate as much in terms of what is happening to them. Quickly, I must share, I had to deal with a specific case regarding a child. She was about a year and something years old, who was abused by her father. Um, and there were indications there were signs there, but persons didn't think that, at this young age, this child could have experienced what the signs were suggesting, right? And so we have to be very, very intentional, be very, very aware of our children and the behaviors that they exemplify. What are the things that would qualify as being out of the norm in terms of how they react, how they interact, and how they respond to specific persons, or just respond in general? So let me, allow the others to go.
Wow, thank you so much. As you share, Minister Tanika, I'm reminded of a case that I had. The child was maybe about 3. And when the child came in, she would hug everybody and kiss everybody, right? And when you delve into her background, you realize that she had some exposure that were not appropriate. Thank you for shedding light on that. So when the child is extra clingy, it's not that them extra love us. We need to find out what's happening there. Thank you. Thank you for breaking that down. Let's go over to Miss Mayor.
Yes. Okay, thanks again. All right. So when we talk about the primary school children now, we're talking about from about age 6 to 12, anywhere from age 6 to 12. All right. So primary level now, children are more verbal at that stage, and so they can talk. They can say what has taken place, what has happened to them. Um, I would say that one of the reactions or symptoms that we see a lot with our primary age children is the reactivity, meaning anger outbursts, especially anger outbursts, right? We do see a lot of that irritability, aggression, right? We see a lot of that in the classroom. When this manifests in the classroom, for example, a lot of the teachers will complain that the child is very disruptive. And not only disruptive, they will also complain that the child is very disrespectful, right? When they're out on the playground, there's a lot of conflicts, and it just seems as if any small thing triggers the child. You'd be wondering. I mean, all the next child did, for example, was just barely brush against, right? And the reaction that you're seeing from the child just seems to be more than the norm that you would anticipate in play or in conflicts and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of that. All right. At this age, we do see some of the symptoms from the younger age as well. So we're seeing the sleep disturbance. We're seeing where many times they tend to isolate themselves. So if you have a child that would normally interact with others, normally outgoing, and then you notice that the child is now isolating themselves, withdrawing, then that is usually a sign that something is has gone wrong or is going wrong, right? At this age, they can describe that they're having intrusive thoughts, right? They can describe that they're having flashbacks, they're having disturbing dreams, nightmares, right? And then we also see some negative emotional patterns, right? So we're seeing the anxiety, we're seeing fear, we're seeing shame, right? So they're ashamed. And just to say about the fear that they feel at this stage as well. Many times, our children in this age group, when they experience, especially physical and sexual abuse, many times they are threatened with death or their family members are threatened. So the perpetrator will say, if you ever dare talk, if you ever dare say anything, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to hurt you, and I'm also going to come off after your family member. And so we find that the child is very afraid, but they will also go into denial. So it doesn't matter how many times you ask them if something has happened, they will not utter a word. They will not say what has happened to them because that fear has taken over. We've also seen bedwetting for this age group, and we also see a decline in school performance. So you have a child that usually does well in their various subjects. They're A students, B students, and then we just see where the grades are just falling because they are having difficulty concentrating. They're not able to focus, right? And so those are some of the things that we see with our primary school age children.
Wow, was an extensive list. I really hope that we're taking note of what is being shared, because trust me, that's very comprehensive. So when we see our children at the primary level being aggressive and acting out, it's not just that they are rude. It means that there may be something more that we need to delve into. All right, let's jump over to Mrs. Smith now for the secondary level.
All right, thanks, Sharika. So, with respect to the secondary level children, now we're looking at the teenagers essentially,
Mhm.
yes? And we know that's a very special group of persons. They're already treating with the psychosocial conflict or navigating the psychosocial conflict of identity versus role confusion, trying to figure out, who am I? How do I fit into this world? What is my role? What is my purpose? So, when you add to that, a traumatic event or several adverse childhood experiences, it tends to perpetuate that challenge that the teenagers are facing. So I just want to say as a caveat, it doesn't automatically mean that because persons are having certain behaviors, it means that they are experiencing trauma. It could also be because of their challenge in navigating the psychosocial conflict of, who am I? With that having been said, I want, based on my practice as well as the research, it's suggesting that in the teenage years, there could be more irritability. So you see the child lashing out, perhaps not commensurate with the stimulus, as Sophie would have mentioned. It also applies to the teenagers. You may see the development of conduct disorders and defiant behaviors, also impairment in academic and social functioning. So they're not cordial with their colleagues. They are disrespectful to persons in authority. Their grades are dropping. They're being called very often to the dean of discipline's office or the principal's office or the guidance counselor's office. There's also at this stage a greater likelihood or propensity for substance abuse. Yes. Also, the impact of peer pressure is tends to be greater with teenagers who are treating with adverse childhood experiences or specific traumatic events. So they're more likely to seek, in some instances, solace in different drugs and alcohol, yes, even as teenagers, as they try to treat with blocking out, yes, this the stimuli and the circumstances which are causing them pain. Interestingly, and it may seem counterintuitive, there may also be symptoms of what we call cutting, whereby they will intentionally inflict scars, wounds, sorry, to their person, often on the arms, the extremities, that can be covered. Yes. So they are doing that as a response. Yes, they need help, right? But they're doing it to feel physiological pain with a view to perhaps numbing or distracting them from the psychological pain. There's also sometimes depressive symptoms, withdrawal, lack of interest in anhedonia, in things that previously interested them, they're no longer interested. There could also be some impairment in memory as they try to repress or repression or suppression of memory takes place. Also, there is sometimes a dissonance or an incongruence with respect to gender and their gender role. And I know this perhaps is a controversial topic, but I have seen, for example, where females who have been victims of sexual abuse, they try to attire themselves as male, what is traditionally considered to be male clothing and male appearance and male demeanor, so that they can, in their view, be unattractive to persons of the opposite sex. And sometimes, too, they may engage in same sex relationships with a view to um, sometimes perpetuating, because it is important to note that sometimes the trauma or the physical, let's use sexual abuse, is not only by persons of the opposite sex. Yes. So we have to look at that as well. And finally, I'd want to mention that in this category of teenagers, sometimes the anxiety manifests in like panic attacks, where they have difficulty breathing and coping and functioning. I'll leave it there for now.
I am sure that you're helping somebody tonight. Somebody's getting help because somebody did not know what else to think about. So thank you so much for sharing. That's very comprehensive, and helping us to know what to look for at the different age, at the different school age. I'll say it like that. But I want us to answer the same question from another perspective, because I know there are also, in terms of the responses, like psychological, we have emotional, we have physical and behavioral symptoms that we can look out for. So while we have shared what they can look out for at the different levels of their academic life, let us talk a little bit about the different categories. So Mrs. Smith is going to take us through the psychological or the emotional symptoms that we can look out for. Miss Mary is going to take us through the physical, and then Mrs. Durant will wrap up that question with the behavioral.
All right. I would have perhaps mentioned some some
Yeah.
of
Yes. Yeah,
the
some of it would have,
yeah, but
definitely.
perhaps I could give a little bit more detail. So, for example, with respect to anxiety, you have different so traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences result in some type of vulnerability, yes, and exposure to danger. So it is not unusual for there to be some type of, perhaps most persons are familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze response as a result of anxiety. So there can be generalized anxiety. So it's not necessarily limited to a particular situation, just generally a sense of something is going to go wrong, somebody's going to hurt me, which can result in like hypervigilance, hypersensitivity. And interestingly, we see even in the workplace. I know we're talking about childhood trauma, but it's the same trauma that some of us has experienced that causes us to behave certain way in the workplace. Can I get an amen? In the school, in church, because we know that hurt people, but I'm going to just keep it moving with that one. So generalized anxiety, there's just a sense of discomfort and uneasiness. Yes, that the children and adults experience. Also, I mentioned, I think, panic attacks earlier, phobic anxiety, where you have irrational fears that can develop. You know, I know some person said the fear of lizard is not an irrational fear, but different fears. Some do might take it as culturally normal, but other phobic anxiety may be manifest. Also, stress disorders, so like post-traumatic stress or acute stress disorder in response to certain stimuli, mood disorders. So you can have moods, for example, swinging from one end of the pendulum or from to the spectrum to the other. Yes, like a pendulum just swinging from side to side. So you can have, periods of euphoria, and then you have periods of just depression, depressive mood. There's also dissociation. There is impairment in memory. I think I would have mentioned that earlier, as well as dependence in terms of alcohol and so on. So it's varied. And again, there might be a sense of loss and a sense of being alone. Also, person's self-esteem can be significantly damaged, and sense of self significantly damaged. I reckon my colleagues will talk about eating disorders and other things, but those disorders are manifested by, or from a sense of, very often, a loss of control. You feel you don't have any control over your life. You feel that, things are just going wrong for you. Disaster can strike at any time. And yeah, those are some that I'll stop for now to allow my colleagues to share from the other perspectives.
Wow, that's all I'll say, and I'll just move it right along. Let me head on over to Miss Mir and then Mrs. Durant.
Okay, all right. So when we talk about physical symptoms, we're basically talking about things that we are seeing, things that are evident. And again, we have mentioned quite a bit of them already. All right, so let's talk about, for example, the self harming. As Mrs. Smith had already spoken about the self harming situation, but basically, what we are finding is that the emotional pain that the client is feeling, the child is feeling, the adolescent is feeling, and just to say self harming behavior is mostly seen in the adolescents. We really don't see a lot of that, thank God, in our primary school children. But I'm not saying that it isn't there, but it is not there as much. It's more for the adolescent. So that is a physical symptom that you're going to see. So they're going to take whatever object, a sharp object, right? You name it. If it's sharp, they'll use it, right? And just again to reiterate to our parents, when they use these sharp objects, usually it's on the forearm, which is clearly seen once they have a short sleeve top that's on. But it can also be on the inside of the leg, on the abdomen, sometimes even on the chest. And they do that to hide it, right? So self harming is a physical one. You also have, as I mentioned before, the bedwetting, right? Enuresis, we see that. You can also have soiling themselves, so not just bedwetting, but defecating on themselves, not as prevalent as the enuresis, but it still happens, right, as a physical symptom. In terms of the avoidance, so when we talk about avoidance of cues, for example, avoidance behavior is that anything that reminds them or is a trigger of the traumatic event, they want to avoid that. Okay, so you will find, for example, if it is that there's a particular perpetrator that perpetrated the act, you know, the parents don't know that this has happened and they're sending the child down to wherever they were, right? They're just not going to go, right? They refuse to go. Okay, so we have the avoidance. Crying, that's another one. Crying behavior, so we see the tears. I spoke already about the reactivity, so in terms of the aggression, which manifests itself many times in fights, so actual fighting, you will see that. The eating disorders, as was mentioned, so the eating behavior has changed. right? So if it is, for example, that your child normally, there's a particular eating pattern, we can see either overeating, so they're just eating, 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 and can't stop eating, or they're not eating at all. So they're not interested in the food. They're not interested in things that they liked doing, right? Activities, for example, that they would be enjoying, they're just not doing that anymore. So let us say that this child normally would sit in front of the television, watch a program, or they'd be interested in watching something on their tablet, or even just going outside and playing. We are not seeing that anymore. So in other words, they're physically withdrawing, not just emotionally withdrawing, physically withdrawing. So they lock up in their room and they're not coming out to interact. Sometimes the withdrawal behavior, they will be in the room and they may be engaging in behavior in terms of looking at the tablet, watching the television, but they're not coming outside for any emotional interaction, right? So those are some of the physical things that you may see happening with your child. Oh, risky behaviors. I don't want to forget that one.
Mm-hmm.
Risky behaviors, and especially for the adolescents as well, risky behavior. I want to say this one, especially a lot of parents. One of the things that happens many times when our children are sexually abused, right? Two things can happen. One, they can shut down completely, so they don't want to have any interaction with anyone, especially of the opposite sex, right? They don't want any interaction at all, right? So they totally shut down where that is concerned. But the other side of that is that you may see hypersexual behavior. And so this child that before this incident did not was not sexually involved with anyone, after the incident, they are having sex with anybody that they can find, right? And believe it or not, that's a psychological situation where when they were being abused sexually, there was a loss of control. They felt no control over their body, right? But now, after the abuse, it's almost as if they're saying, I am the one that's going to be in control now. So I am deciding that I will give it to whomever wants it. And so there's a sense of they are now in control. And so that is how you end up sometimes with the hypersexual behavior taking place. So those are some of the physical things that you may see.
All right. Again, a very long list. Very insightful. Mrs. Durant, I don't know if you have anything to add after those two.
I tell you, let me tell you, in terms of behavioral,
Uh-huh.
um, let me just put it this way. The parents them just can't manage it in them, right? Um, that's it.
We
In
hear
terms of
you.
the aggression, right? The aggressive behaviors that we um based on where I work, we get a lot of reports regarding children who were previously deemed uncontrollable, but we're changing the phrase and so forth. But children who the parents just can't manage them, right? And the research does support the view that hey, this could be linked to childhood trauma, and these could be responses to traumatic events. And so, as a response to that, um, the agency where I am employed, we are rolling out, or we have rolled out, a trauma informed behavior modification program that we're implementing across all the childcare facilities across the island, because we recognize that because the children who have to come in contact with the care system have experienced so much trauma, some of them a lot of them complex trauma. I mean, they would have experienced a number of traumatic events and so forth, and we see them it manifesting in their behaviors, how they respond to each other, how they respond to staff, how they adjust to society, and all of that. We have identified the need to roll out a program that recognizes that hey, this thing about the effects of trauma and on the children's behavior is a real thing, and we have to be intentional about how we are going to intervene to help them to cope with what they would have experienced coming into in contact with the care system. And so we would have mentioned some of the behavioral manifestations already that I will not get into, but just to recognize that it's a real challenge as it relates to children. And we're going to see some of the children that you just, we can't bother with, and you want to give up on, and you just don't know what to do. You're tearing out your hair literally. Some of them are really responding to traumatic events. Have to bear that in mind.
Mhm. Yes, I see Sharika's joined from a different device.
I'm trying to fix the problem. I'm trying. I'm
Yeah.
trying, but Digicel will not allow me to. But thank you so much. I heard most of what was said, and I mean that's brilliant in terms of helping us to understand that. I don't remember the term, but allow me to use the old term for now. When the children seem uncontrollable, it's not that the child is just rude, but there's more to be explored, there's more to delve into, and so I really do hope that we're paying attention. All right, so we are transitioning now to talk about the impact. Some of the symptoms would sound like impact. So what I want us to zoom in on, we mentioned earlier in terms of the sources. So I know there's trauma at home, trauma at school and community, and then trauma on a personal level. So I want us to focus, is there any difference in terms of how these affect the persons who have experienced trauma? So I'm going to start with Miss Mayor. Who did I start with last time? I don't even remember. But let's go with Miss Mayor and talk about, when a child experiences trauma at school. No, not just bullying, but this can include rejection from peers, or they have witnessed crime and violence in the community. How does this impact that child? What are some of the implications of trauma experience at school and in the community?
Mhm. Wow. Trauma experienced at school and in the community. All right, I want to talk about the fact that, one of the reasons why we are really talking about childhood trauma, because, trauma can be experienced at all levels, right? Once you're a child, if you're an adult, anybody can have a trauma response. We didn't really go into the different types of trauma. But for example, car accidents, war, natural disasters, physical abuse, verbal abuse, all of those things. So just to say that anybody can experience trauma. But one of the reasons why we want to zero in on the children is that when we consider that a child has experienced rejection, whether in the community or at school, when a child has experienced violence, when they experience it directly in the community, or they witness it in the community, what we want to recognize is that one of the things that is happening to the child is that it is now going to impact the child in terms of their thought patterns and what we call the schemas that they develop, right? So, what is actually happening? They're going to develop thought patterns and schemas about themselves, what they think about themselves. They're going to be developing these thoughts and schemas about other people. And they're also going to be developing schemas about the world in general. All right. So, you have experienced sexual abuse, rejection. Let's talk about the rejection, for example, or bullying. This child is now going to be thinking, I am worthless, I am not valuable, right? And that now is going to impact their self-esteem, okay, and their confidence level, okay. When these traumatic events, the impact that is going to be on their thought patterns and their schema about how they think about other people, they're going to be thinking about other people cannot be trusted, right? Other people will harm me, right? And so they're going to develop this mistrust. And so trying to build relationships, especially in later years when they're now trying to get into relationships, there's a lot of mistrust they just don't trust people. And sometimes it leads to paranoia, right? That's an impact. And then finally, just in terms of what they think of the world, the world is a hostile place. The world is a place that will kill you. The world is a place that will harm you. And so, a lot of their potential, their blossoming is impacted because the world is just such an unsafe place. And so they have to gingerly go, and their creativity is impacted and stuff like that. So, those are some of the things that you're going to find when they experience the trauma in the school, in terms of the bully and the rejection and the shaming. And yes, they do experience the sexual and physical things in the school and in the community, with the violence and all of that. That is the impact that I'm seeing when it actually begins in childhood.
I think Sharika is having a challenge again.
Okay.
Uh, Tanika, you'd like to go ahead in terms of any other aspect?
Sure. Um, just to say, I remember when I was a part of a group of persons that was being trained in terms of trauma informed care. They the facilitator brought to our attention this book called The Brain Keeps Score, and it's a book that I would recommend to persons, who are interested in terms of the effects of trauma on the brain, because the physical structure of the brain literally changes as a
Yes.
result of trauma. And we know that when that changes, and that affects the other aspects of our lives as well, our behavior, our thought processes, and all of that. Another thing that I see a lot of, when as relates to children who are victims of trauma or would have experienced trauma specifically in their homes, is a lot of self blame and a lot of guilt. I talk a lot about sexual abuse because I unfortunately have to interface a lot with children who are victims of that kind of abuse. Um, and oftentimes they will say, if I had not reported it, then my father, for example, or my relative would not have been incarcerated. My mother would not have been left alone to take care of my other siblings, or I would not have been placed in state care. I would still be with my family. So there's a lot of self-blame, and there's a lot of guilt that is associated with. So they're processing the traumatic event or events. They're processing the separation. They're processing their own anxieties as well, and all of that. You spoke about the adverse childhood experiences. When our ACE score is at a certain level, you recognize that it impacts how we operate even as adults. When there are certain levels of dysfunctionality in our interpersonal relationships, etc., it comes right back to the things that we faced as children, and how we were able to cope with those traumatic experiences. And so it is important to recognize, how, for example, neglect affects children, how violence in the home affects children, how absenteeism affects children. In Jamaica, unfortunately, some of our fathers are not present in the home. They don't play a significant role in the lives of the children. And it's as if, that has been normalized to an extent, and we don't realize that that too has a negative effect on the children, and so forth. And it's traumatic for them when parents separate. I think Shauna, you spoke about that earlier, when there's divorce and so on. The children are often caught in the middle. I have to choose, between whether it's mommy or daddy, and it's not about co-parenting anymore, etc. And so trauma affects children in so many different ways. And it's so very, very important that they are provided with the level of support, the psychosocial support, the therapeutic support that is necessary to help them cope and to move on to lead functional and productive lives.
Indeed, indeed. And I'll just perhaps just speak on the impact on trauma experienced if it's a sexual, emotional, or physical abuse, focus on the personal level. And one of the studies coming out of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention out of the USA mentioned that 1 in 6 adults has experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. So
Mm,
it's like a compounding effect that often ensues. And one of the things that I've, been in my recent study appreciating that ACEs are linked to chronic health problems. So sometimes we think it is just, the psychological effect, but I want to perhaps emphasize the physiological effect because you can imagine the body's natural response to certain stimulus is the fight or flight response. Yes. So adrenaline is rushing. You want to know what to do. You're on a state of hypervigilance. You're alert because you're going to either run or you're going to fight. But can you imagine if that response happens to you in perpetuity because you are in a consistent state of panic? Then it
mhm,
means that physiologically our bodies are not going to cope very well with that. And that even is if only one exposure. So you might say, no, man, if this only applies to persons who have been exposed over 6 years, 10 years, not necessarily. Because if that individual responds to that one traumatic event in a way that creates that stimulation in perpetuity, the impact ultimately will be the same. And as a cognitive behavioral therapist, we know that our thoughts affect our emotions, which affect our behavior. And when our thoughts say, oh, I need to be extra vigilant because, as Sophie said, our schema is that this world is unsafe and I'm in a perpetual potential state of danger. Can you imagine what this is doing for your blood pressure?
mhm,
What that's doing to your heart? What's that doing to your lungs? Yes. So a lot of the health problems are often associated with, and research is ongoing, but I found it very interesting that if we treat with some of these ACEs and treat with the effects even in adulthood, we can maximize our quality of life from a physical health perspective. Also, we find that in adulthood and even in childhood, there's a difficulty, as was mentioned earlier, forming bonds, feelings of guilt, shame, lack of trust. I've had the benefit of assisting, for example, couples in premarital counseling or even after marriage in some counseling sessions. And we find that sometimes the things that have not been dealt with,
mhm,
they come and sit right in front of you in the present, in the couch, in the present. And you might say, oh, when you look at the intake form, they would have perhaps indicated rape or emotional abuse and neglect. And they say, but it don't affect me. It don't affect me. Me get over that. Because perhaps we have not treated with it. We push it to the back of our minds, but it comes out in our conversation. It comes out in our treatment of others, our children, our spouses. Low self-esteem, I think, was already treated with. Promiscuity, substance abuse. Um, one of the challenges that I'll use this as the last one in terms of sometimes even in places that should provide solace like church or schools, that is the place where persons are so hurt or affected with emotional abuse, and we sometimes don't realize how impactful our words are. The saying that says sticks and stones may break my bones but words will never hurt me, that is a lie. And we have to be intentional with what we say and how we affirm life and positivity into our children. Don't just talk when you're doing something wrong, but affirm positivity. Reframe your thought process and how you treat with children because their sense of self will have an will this will be displayed when they become adults, whether for the better or for the worse. I think Sharika is back.
I'm back and I'm almost traumatized.
Oh,
And so let's just go right to where I can get help. Where can we find help? And if we're experiencing or have experienced childhood trauma, because I'm sure some persons right here tonight were saying, "Okay, I recognize this. How can I get help? Where can I go?" Um, And Joanna K, you alluded to it well. In fact, all the experts alluded to the fact that the theme tonight, it says childhood trauma, my life tells the tale. Because
Mhm.
even though it may have happened in childhood, it's something I'm living out. It's something that's showing up even when I'm not conscious of it. So we need help. Tell us, where can we find help? Let me start with Mrs. Durant. Then we go to Miss Mayor and then over to Mrs. Smith. Where can I go? Because we need help. We need help.
All right, so I'm going to speak specifically to the children, right? There are state entities and agencies that are in place to provide assistance, counseling, and psychotherapeutic support. We do have the Child Protection and Family Services Agency, and there is a cohort of clinical psychologists who are on board to assist children who are victims of trauma and have to interface with the care system. There's also the Child Guidance Clinic and clinics across the island, victim services division, victim support unit, um, uh, as well as some other state agencies that provide therapeutic support free of cost for persons, who are able to afford private practice, a private practitioner. There are private practices across the island that you can access services. But in terms of children, if you have financial challenge, you don't have any money, but your child is in need of some intervention, then there are state agencies that are in place where you can access some support.
Okay, so Mrs. Durant, what you're saying is that I should no longer use the cost for therapy as the
As
reason
an
for not
excuse.
getting my child help.
That's right.
Absolutely,
Oh,
absolutely.
okay, all right, thank you. And you did say CPFSA, you said Child Guidance Clinic, and
Vic-
then you can do
Victim
victim
service,
support.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
all right, we're writing them down, because we need help. All right, anything else to add, Miss Mayor, Mrs. Smith?
Okay. Okay. So we've been talking about trauma all night, and just to say that it's on a continuum, right? So you can have mild responses and you can have severe responses, right? So believe it or not, our guidance counselors in the schools, sometimes they're like one of the first places, because they pick up a lot in the schools, right? Our guidance counselors in many schools, they're doing a fabulous job. If it is that it's beyond their scope, then they will refer them to the child guidance clinics, or they refer them to CPFSA, right? Or they refer them out, right? So don't underestimate or counselors or guidance counselors church. Again, depending on the nature of the trauma, it get for mild trauma, a lot of our pastors are trained counselors, right, Chuana? A
Indeed.
lot of our pastors, right, Minister Durant, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so a lot of pastors right now, and I tell you, it has really exploded over the years in terms of our pastors, going for training, because they have recognized the need for being able to counsel at a higher level than just pastoral counseling. So we do find that in our churches, a lot of our pastors are actually able to offer counseling services. Also, attached to many churches are actual counseling centers, right? So not just the pastor, no, but you have a lot of churches that have official counseling centers, and they have trained clinicians, right? So and a lot of these churches that have counseling centers, for example, Swallowfield Chapel has a counseling center attached to them. I think Marvelly Gospel Hall has one, and there are others
Bethel.
that yes, Bethel Baptist Church. Okay, and they have trained professionals there. And if there's even a cost, it's minimal, right? So you also have, you can access those resources. So those are three that I can add as to places that you can get help.
All right. And if I could just quickly add now, so the first step is to recognizing that you need help.
Mhm.
So sometimes, as you say, the manifestation may be mild. Don't wait until it gets to the severe stage. if it can be avoided. Yes, so treat with it and intervene as quickly as possible. And as parents, we are not, I don't know about you, but I didn't go to college to become a parent. No one took me. I didn't spend 6 years in a master's program or a doctorate program to learn how to be a parent, right? So there's no shame in saying I need help and getting the help. Secondly, we have to reframe, as we said, some of the cultural challenges. I remember one of the things I found remarkable. When one parent said it, I was like, then two, then three. Then when the fourth person said it in that same environment in which I was doing counseling, I don't know what's wrong with the child. And them have Visa and them have PlayStation. So after the first cup, I'm like, but the mindset was basically a Visa, I have PlayStation. And what could I stress you? You know what I mean? So once you reframe, get the help. All right, good. So from a legal perspective, I don't want us to think about no our child and somebody that is at our church. But remember, if you observe a child being abused, we have a duty under the law. The Child Care and Protection Act suggests that we should not sit by and do nothing. Yes, we have this cockroach business and foul fight mentality, but we need to do better, right? And to protect our children. Protecting our children is everybody's business. So reporting to CPFSA, in terms of, I don't think we had hit this one, colleagues, which about the suicidal ideation and suicidal tendencies and so on. Yes. So especially with the rejection and the bullying and the abuse, sometimes this is also a manifestation, and even among children. So you might hear they say, I don't want to be here anymore. I feel like I could have just walked in front of a bus. Don't take these things lightly. Yes. So I have personally referred persons to Choose Life International. They treat
Yes.
specifically with persons who may have that suicidal thoughts or ideation, and even who have attempted. Yes. Also, there are various counseling agencies, religious based, non religious, and I think you have, for example, Family Life Ministries, you have the Counseling Center at the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology. There are many, they have individual counselors. They can Google, but of course, when you use the University of Google, please ensure that these counselors are appropriately trained, because they can do more harm than good if it is that the appropriate training is not in place.
All right, well said. We have three questions. I'm going to ask each person to answer one. We're wrapping up, we're almost at the end. And then I'll allow persons to share their final thoughts. All right? So, question number one says, how can you help persons who are challenged, whether they have some disability, so they may not hear, or they may have visual impairment? Forgive me if I'm not using the correct terminologies. How can you help those persons? That's one. Anyone want to take that one?
Um, the fact of the matter is that there is a real challenge in terms of identifying when abuse is being meted out to persons in this cohort, in this group. There are challenges because of their lack of ability to articulate. And so oftentimes we find that they are victims, they are targeted, because persons think that, oh, well, the chance of me being prosecuted is limited. All right. And so it's very, very important that the caregivers and the persons in the homes are very, very keen and very, very observant. I think we would have been made aware in recent times of a young lady who was, I think she was comatose in the hospital, was not able to speak and so forth, and then they realized that she was pregnant. Right? Yes, that made the news recently. And so when children are not able to articulate, as I would have said previously, they are oftentimes victimized. And so the onus is on us as a society, caregivers, yes, in the immediate space, but also other persons who come in contact with. So if a child is mute, for example, and attending school, say for example Caribbean Christian Center for the Deaf or so, then the persons at school are going to be very, very important in terms of making observations and reporting same if anything untoward is observed, because the child just will not be able to help him or herself. So the point is that the caregivers, the persons in their immediate spheres of influence and so on are going to be very, very critical in terms of providing the necessary support to this population, because they are very, very vulnerable. And if it is that it is, certain signs and so on are observed, then there are professionals who are trained. I think
Yes.
there's an aspect of the police that has been trained, to in terms of how you proceed with prosecutorial procedures and all of those things. I hope that helps.
And just to also add that persons in our special needs community, if we consider, for example, that in terms of how they learn. So let's take, for example, a child that is mute, or a child that is deaf, for example. There are specially trained individuals, specially trained teachers who are able to teach them, right? So some of the methods that they would have used are some of the same methods that you can use in therapy, right? So, for example, as a therapist, you may not, let's say you're dealing with a child that is hearing impaired. You may not know sign language, all right, but you can write, and especially if the child is able to read, then you can communicate with that child through that medium, right? So that is one way in terms of finding that medium in which you can communicate with the child, right? The child that is visually impaired, there are ways that the teachers, are able to interface with them, braille and other things. So some of these same methods that can be used to teach them is some of the same methods that we can use as well. But additionally, one of the things that happens when children come into, for example, the government system, so whether CPFSA or child guidance, if it is that it is above our scope, then there are other persons that we may be able to refer the child to that is specialized in that area, because there are persons in Jamaica that can treat with persons with special needs. It's just so they come to us first, and we will do initial assessments, and then after we do the assessments, then we are now going to refer the child to a trained therapist who is able to interface with them.
All right, thank you so much. The other question is, and I think it was alluded to, how can I help a child that is visibly suffering from trauma due to circumstances in the household but is unable to get out of that environment?
I could perhaps start with that one.
Go ahead.
So I have a colleague, and she said that she would never treat with a child in terms of child therapy. And I asked why. She says because a child does not exist in isolation. So she doesn't call it child therapy, she calls it family therapy. Yes. So, I thought that was quite instructive. So basically, to start, ideally, you start with the parents, motivating the parents, engaging with the parents with a view to appreciate that there's a problem. Not because they have Visa or PlayStation, there's a problem. And, again, some of us as parents may get defensive, you're criticizing my parenting, but to the extent that you can engage with the parent and get the buy-in of the parent, I think that's a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you have engagement perhaps with a teacher, if you observe it in a school setting, yes, it is possible for the teacher or the guidance counselor at the school to also do an intervention. Let's say you're a neighbor and you're seeing something that is really grossly inappropriate with respect to the child. I believe that at the end of the day, there is still a duty, or, you're encouraged, certainly at the very least, to make a report about it. Because at the end of the day, you would not want to see that child meet his demise, whether by his own hands or that of the abuser.
All right, thank you. Well, very comprehensive. All right, so this comment I want to bring to our attention, and this would be the last question, after which I'll hand over to each of you to just take 2 minutes to share your final thoughts. So this person says, not to be ignorant, but how does one ensure confidentiality when going to these agencies without subconsciously wondering if their business would be on Front Street?
May I respond?
Sure.
As a practitioner in one of those agencies. All right. So we are duty bound to be confidential. And so when you make a report to, for example, the Office of the Children's Register, which is the central repository for, cases of child abuse and so forth. You do not have to give your information in terms of your name and specifics, right? And your information, the information that you give, as well as if you choose to give your name, that has to be held in strict of confidence. And we can be prosecuted if we are found to have disclosed your information or breach your confidence. And so we are duty bound to be confidential. It's not like we're going to say, okay, John Brown came to us and reported that, this abuse is taking place or that abuse is taking place, and so forth. No, that's not the system that is in place currently. And if it is that there are breaches, then there are severe consequences for us as practitioners.
All right, well said. Thank you so much. So there you have it, talk, pinky talk. We are bound, to maintain confidentiality. On the other end of the spectrum, now we can control you feeling like your business will be out there. So you will now have to talk to yourself and to say, okay, my business will not be out there because these people are confidential. It's a part of what they do, and if they breach confidentiality, they will be punished. All right, so sometimes we have to counsel ourselves through the process. All right,
Mhm.
what a night. Eh?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to bring the curtain down, and so I'm going to give each expert, each of the panelists, 2 minutes just to share their final thoughts. Our topic tonight, again, for those who joined us late, is childhood trauma. My life tells the tale, and they have ripped this topic apart. They have said so many information, or so much information has been shared, that you really have to watch it again. You really have to watch it again. All right, so each person have 2 minutes. Who is going first? At this point, you volunteer to go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Get it out of the way. All right. So, my heart is really with the parents and how they treat their children.
Yeah.
I started out by talking about emotional and verbal abuse as one of the main ones that we are seeing, that we see every day, right? And it's really because of our of parenting styles and how we parent. And so when you think about emotional and verbal abuse, we're looking at, shaming the child and putting down the child. So calling them names, you're stupid, you're worthless. I want to you, those kind of things, right? When we look at rejection, we're just rejecting the child, right? You don't want the child to really be around you. We say in Jamaican language, you run the picnic, right? Run with the picnic, man, run with the picnic, right? There's another one that I want to talk about, and the language for it is corrupting. They call it corrupting, right? This one is where the parent is the one that is um helping the child in the antisocial behaviors. And I'm going to give one example that, trust me, this one get to my soul. You see, when as a parent you send your child to the shop to purchase cigarette, marijuana, or liquor, that is abuse, you may not even recognize that that is abuse, because what you are now doing is that you are exposing your child to these items at an early age, And what happens many times is that somewhere along the line, the child on many occasions will end up going back to that shop when you did not send them and purchase those items. And the shopkeeper, unfortunately, what is happening in our country is that a lot of our shopkeepers, they're just about the money. They don't really care who it is that's coming to purchase the item. So even if it's a child that's coming to purchase the item, they want a sale. And so they're selling the items to our children. And also for the parents who do a lot of comparisons. Why you can't be like Johnny? Why you can't do well right like this? Why you can't do well right like that? You understand me? So I just want to say that these things are really emotional abuse, and our parents, please be aware. If you didn't know before, you know now, and you are going to be held responsible for what you know. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for sharing. All right,
All
who's
right.
next?
I think I want to go next. Let Shawana just cap it all. So trauma, I want to borrow this quote. It says, trauma is too much for too long with too little support. And we want to change that dynamic, right? We want to provide as much support as is possible. And so I want to borrow um, the four pillars for holding um, children together in terms of children who are dealing with trauma and so on. And it says the first pillar has to do with people, those whom they rely on for strength and reassurance. Be that person that your child can rely on for strength and reassurance. The place, the familiar setting where they feel comfortable and safe. Let home be the child's safe space. Thirdly, routine, the regular, dependable daily plan. And fourthly, ritual, comforting traditions. So, yes, we may not have been able to prevent the traumatic event. We may not be able to even prevent traumatic events in the future, but we can be that safe space for our children to provide that level of support that they need to help to navigate through the event or events and to help them to cope when they have to deal with traumatic events in their lives. Events that may have happened in the past and events that they may face or will face in the future. So be present, present, and also provide the necessary support that you would want to receive if you would have been a victim of trauma. I'm just one example. I'm just thinking and just reflecting, as adults, when we experience trauma, it is so hard for us to manage. Just imagine a child,
Mm-hmm.
just imagine how children respond and how they feel helpless and hopeless and defenseless and so on. So let us be that support and that cushion that your child may need or somebody else's child may need to navigate this whole thing about trauma. Thank you.
Well said. Over to you, ma'am. Close us out.
All right. So I just want to encourage us as adults from two perspectives. One, as we treat with children, and if we can, I think sometimes we're so grown we forget what it was like to be a child. And I just want to start where Tanika left off. Think about the perspective of the child and choose wisely. I think the priority should be given not to your pride, but to the welfare of the child. And as a legal practitioner as well, teaching family law, one of the principles that is like the bedrock of family law is that the welfare of the child is the first and paramount consideration. All other considerations must rest upon that pillar. So it is actually quite unselfish when we treat with the welfare of the child first. So any fear about, I don't want people to know my business. Remember that the child's best interest is what should be paramount. Now, from your perspective as an adult, you may have gone through some childhood trauma. It is important for us to recognize that healing can take place and that there are tools There are persons out there to help you if you find that your own resources are not sufficient to cope. Because that's essentially, as Tanika said, that's what trauma really is. Something that overwhelms our response because something has overwhelmed our ability to cope. There's an unknown quote that I usually, I like to use. It says, perhaps the butterfly is proof that you can go through a great deal of darkness, yet become something beautiful.
Beautiful.
There is a beauty in your story, and there is hope for you. There are a team of persons available to help you choose life, literally and figuratively. Choose life, embrace grace, equip yourself, listen, be patient, and be a safe space for others to grow and flourish, even as you take steps to be the best version of yourself and be all that God has called you to be. Thank you.
All right. So I don't want to spoil all of that. So we're just going to wrap it up here. I mean, we have learned so much tonight, from quotes to choose life, as somebody put in the chat. So I really just want to say, listen, a very, very big thank you to all our panelists who took the time out to come and share with us tonight. I mean, have learned so much, and I'm trusting that you have learned too. So I just want to encourage you just to go ahead and share, go ahead and send it to someone so they too can benefit from what was shared tonight. So thank you so much, Mrs. Durant. Thank you so much, Mrs. Smith. Thank you so much, Miss Mayor. Thank you all who have taken the time out to just come and be with us tonight. Listen, I was richly fed. I'm a church girl, so let me speak that way. I was really fed tonight, and I just want to encourage us to not just listen, but to apply that which we have learned. All right, so we will be back. Next month is what? May? We'll be back June with more mindful conversations. So set your alarm, join us, and we will have another insightful conversation for you. God bless you, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to Mindful Conversations. See you soon as our series continues. Remember to